This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On April the 5th, our Military History Night featured retired Naval Lieutenant Joseph Frey of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, whose theme was Of Terror and Hell, the Franklin mass disaster of 1848, and the discovery of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. And with that, Joseph, the lectern is yours.
I'd like to start off by thanking Eric Morris for extending an invitation for me to speak here at the Royal Canadian Military Institute. I first came here in 1988 when I joined the Canadian Armed Forces. And there are a couple of individuals I recognize, Bob Kennedy in the back, who he and I served together, and now Brigadier General John McEwen.
Yeah.
Thank you. And, back then when I joined, Brigadier Generals looked so old, and now they look so young. But anyhow, it's good to see you, both of you gentlemen, again after all these years. Anyhow, I was fortunate to be one of 5 members of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society that were asked to participate in the 2014 Victoria Strait expedition, where we ultimately discovered Sir John Franklin's flagship HMS Erebus. And the title of my presentation, Of Terror and Hell, does outline exactly what the men of the Royal Navy went through. Terror, named after HMS Terror, and the reference to hell is in reference to the other warship, HMS Erebus, which in Greek mythology was a mythical creature who was a guardian to hell. And you can see the ice that we dealt with in 2014. These ice conditions were absolutely nothing compared to what they would have been in the mid-1800s when Franklin's expedition went on their way through the Northwest Passage. To give you some idea of where the ships are, they're right up in the high Canadian Arctic, and the ships were eventually found. You'll notice Cambridge Bay. Both Erebus and Terror were found to the right, to the east of Cambridge Bay. As I mentioned, Erebus was found in 2014, and 2 years later, Terror was found in 2016, a bit to the north of Erebus. The British Royal Navy wanted to, along with merchant interests, and the newly formed Royal Geographical Society in London, wanted to find a route through the Arctic, again for commercial reasons primarily. Well, the merchant class for commercial reasons, to find a shorter trade route to China rather than going around South America or Africa. And then the Royal Navy, things haven't changed much, but we're worried about the Russians in Alaska, because back then Alaska was part of Russia. So the Royal Navy was interested in finding a route through the Northwest Passage to counteract the Russians, but also as well to find a shorter route to the Northern Pacific and to China. So 2 expeditions were launched, one by Lieutenant William Perry, who in 1819, guess I can't say, anyhow, the red line, 1819 to 1820, that's the furthest east he made it, because the ice at that point in time was about 50 feet above sea level, and that's what he ran into. And so 1820, that's the furthest any ship could get through in the Northwest Passage. And it wasn't until the 1850s that the next ship could actually go beyond that point because of ice conditions back then. And then Sir John Ross, or Captain Ross at the time, in his 1829-1833 expedition, made it down to the bottom of the Bothia Peninsula. And had he actually noticed, he had sailed past a strait called Bellot Strait, which is difficult to see when you're in that region. I've sailed through it once in 2014. And had he found it, he would have probably been the first to get through the Northwest Passage. But anyhow, so by the time Franklin starts his expeditions in 1845, that's the furthest ships had ever gone through the Northwest Passage. The British Arctic expedition of 1845, Franklin's expedition, consisted of 2 ships, as I've mentioned, Erebus and Terror. Had 129 officers and crew, took 3 years worth of provisions. They felt that they could make it through in 1 year, but just to be on the safe side, they took 3 years of provisions, and mainly canned foods, which at the time was pretty revolutionary. And the 2 ships, Erebus and Terror, were picked because they were British naval Hecla-class gunships. So these ships were twice as strong as a regular warship of the time because they were meant to go close to shore, either seacoast or go up rivers, and they had massive mortars, so 100-pounder mortars on deck, so that they could lob their shells right behind enemy fortifications walls. So a normal Hecla-class warship was twice as strong as a regular British frigate of the time, but then they reinforced Erebus and Terror, so they were 4 times stronger than a ship of that period, so that they wouldn't be crushed by ice. They also had rounded bottoms, so if they were caught in ice, they'd be pushed up. And that's eventually what did happen to them, rather than having a more traditional sort of V-shaped hull where the ice could crush the hull and sink the ship. And Erebus and Terror were the first 2 ships to circumnavigate the Antarctic, and under Sir James Clark Ross, and circumnavigate the Antarctic in regards to sailing close to shore. Anyhow, Sir John Franklin, he did lead 2 expeditions on land through Canada up to what is now Nunavut and the Northwest Territories, and he mapped the coastlines. And the only other officer in the Royal Navy at the time who had mapped more coastline than Franklin was Captain George Vancouver. And Franklin's first expedition, he lost 10 men due to starvation, and that sort of sullied his reputation. But the problem was, it wasn't really his fault. It was that he had contracted with the Hudson's Bay Company to supply food. The Hudson's Bay Company was at the time fighting with the Northwest Company, and the Hudson's Bay Company just never supplied him with the food that he required. His second expedition in 1825-1827, he'd learned his lesson, and so that he pre-prepared food depots before the expedition actually started, and on that expedition he didn't lose anyone. And then he's sent down to Van Diemen's Land, which is now Tasmania in Australia. He's made governor, and he falls out with the local elite because he wants to improve prison conditions for the prisoners in Tasmania, and that just ruffled too many feathers, so he's sent back to England in disgrace. And so he wanted to clear his name. So when the expedition came up to find a passage way through the Northwest Passage, he volunteers for it. Initially, it's first offered to Captain Ross, but Captain Ross is recently married. He's promised his young wife that, no, I'm not going to do any more polar expeditions. So he's out of the picture because he was really the Royal Navy's first choice. And Sir John Franklin goes in front of the Admiralty Board, and they look at his application and they said, well, you're 60 years old. You're too old. And he says, no, my lords, I'm only 59. And that made all the difference. So he got command of the 1845 British Arctic expedition. These are the senior officers. These photographs were taken just before the expedition left in 1845. So Sir John Franklin, who's overall commander of the expedition, Captain Crozier, who was second in command of the expedition, and captain of HMS Terror, and Commander James Fitzjames, who was captain of HMS Erebus. So anyhow, they were really convinced that that the expedition would make it in 1 year. Behind the expedition was Roderick Murchison, who was president of the newly founded Royal Geographical Society, and he really was the main driver behind the Royal Navy to get this expedition going. The officers really think that by summer of 1846, they're going to be in China. And when you read the letters, the last batch of letters sent back are from Greenland, from the southwest coast of Greenland, from an area called Disco Bay, which was a major Danish whaling station. The officers are writing letters back to England and to the Admiralty, and yes, this is going to work out, and we're looking forward to this, and things are just going to be grand, and a year from now we'll have discovered the route through the Northwest Passage. Whereas when you read the letters from the lower ranks, from the more junior ranks, they're going, well, we don't think this is going to end up so well, and because again, officers in a leadership position, you have to remain positive. The more junior ranks weren't overly sure once they reached Greenland that this was going to go so well. And in fact, there's one letter, I think it was from the ship's carpenters, from one of the two ships. And he writes a letter home to his wife and basically states, I don't think I'm going to see you and the children, so this is the last letter you'll receive from me. And sadly, he was correct. Anyhow, so the last time the ships are seen are by a British whaler at the entrance to Lancaster Sound, which is the eastern entrance to the Northwest Passage. And instructions were left that if word hadn't reached back to England by the summer of 1848, that a rescue expedition should be mounted. And in fact, by the spring of 1848, in March, the first relief expedition is sent by the British House of Commons. So for the search for Franklin, so they go back to Sir James Ross, who they wanted to lead the expedition in the first place. And so the Royal Navy outfitted an expedition to look for Franklin, Erebus, and Terror. And this is really the only rescue expedition that had any chance of finding the Franklin's crew members alive. All the following expeditions, while they were hopeful by that point, the crew members had already perished. So they did everything from capturing foxes and tying notes to the foxes and letting the foxes run loose again, hoping that they would run into the expedition and so on. Clearly it didn't work. Ross had enough provisions to go out for a few years, but he came back after a year because 7 members of his crew had died. They didn't know why the deaths had occurred. And even back in the 1840s, 1850s, having 7 crew members on a Royal Navy vessel die of unexplained causes was unusual. So he made the decision to keep his men alive and go back to England. He received a lot of criticism, but personally I think he had done the right thing by returning to England and saving the rest of his crew. Again, even till today, we're still not sure why his 7 members of his crew died so suddenly. Then the first reference to Franklin's expedition are 3 graves found on Beechey Island, which is a small island off Devon Island near Resolute Bay. Anyone in the armed forces today knows that the Canadian Army has a polar warfare training center in Resolute Bay. So just east of Resolute Bay, you'll find Devon Island and Beechey Island. And so Ross is, so they found in 1850 remnants of camps on shore, plus the armorer's forge, and plus the graves of 3 of Franklin's crew members who died during the winter of 1845-1846. So then Dr. John Ray, who's Scottish, leads so he goes on 4 expeditions to try and recover Franklin's crews. Certainly the last 2 expeditions were actual attempts to look for Franklin. The first 2 were more exploratory expeditions. And basically, he comes back to England in 1845 with evidence that Franklin's crew had started cannibalizing their dead members. And initially, he found this out by speaking to Inuit. And of course, this caused a real backlash in England. Charles Dickens went after him. The head of the U.S. American Geographical Society went after John Ray because, of course, Englishmen do not cannibalize other Englishmen. Which, of course, wasn't true. These men were starving, and it was their only food source. So John Ray is the only officer or individual from the United Kingdom that went on an expedition to try and find Franklin and his crew that wasn't knighted. Everyone else who had gone over to try and find Franklin, they were all knighted except for John Ray, because the rest didn't talk about the cannibalization and so on. So then Francis McClintock was a Royal Navy officer who takes leave of absence from the Royal Navy and goes out on a steam yacht called the Fox, which was funded by public subscription and was really put out by Lady Franklin, Sir John's wife. And so he then goes out and leads a very extensive overland expedition. His expedition is extremely important because he finds, by talking to the local Inuit in Nunavut, that they had indeed seen 2 ships go through the area years before. And then they talked about bodies of English sailors lying in different areas on King William Island. And so anyhow, McClintock then discovers bleached skeleton of a Royal Navy steward. And what was happening, that as the men were marching, again, dependent on what year they died in, but by certainly 1840, not 1849, 1850, they were so starved that as they were marching, they were just falling dead. And most of the skeletal remains found of Franklin's crew members is that the individuals are face first in the ground, so they just kept walking till they dropped dead. And then later on, McClintock finds a field hospital, and then he also finds a lifeboat with two skeletons in it, and along with odd things like books and scented soap and curtain rods and so on, all of which is dead weight. Like, why would you be pulling in a lifeboat all these extra things? Well, probably because by that point in time, lead poisoning had set in, scurvy had set in. That has a negative impact on your mental capabilities. And so by this point in time, the crew members were no longer rational, and they were packing things they didn't need. Apparently the lifeboat alone weighed about 1,200 pounds. So pulling 1,200 pounds overland, loaded up with soaps and so on, books, just made absolutely no sense. So by this point in time, the crew members, their mental health had really deteriorated. So Franklin was given orders that every time he made a major landfall, he was supposed to build a cairn and leave notes inside them. Well, he built cairns, but didn't leave notes inside of them, except for one cairn, which is known as the Victory Point cairn, which is on the northwest corner of King William Island. And there's only 2 messages written on it. So the first message, dated May 24th, 1847, Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition, all well. Okay. Second message, written in April 1848, so almost a year later, Her Majesty's ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd of April, having been beset in ice since September 12th, 1846. Sir John Franklin died on 11th of June, 1847. So just a few weeks before Sir John Franklin's writing, oh, everything's great. A few weeks later, he's dead. And then the other odd thing is that they go on to list the number of deaths. Well, 9 officers are dead and 15 men, which in itself is really odd because there are far more sailors than there are officers. So why the high rate of death rate amongst the officers? One theory is there may have been something in the food the officers are eating, because the officers paid for their own supplies, brought in their own foodstuffs, which were separate from what the more junior ranks ate. So that seems to be the only explanation, but again, we really don't know why the disproportionate number of dead officers compared to the rest of the crew. So this I just wanted to show is, just to finish off on sort of the history of the Franklin, is so you can see the 2 routes, his 2 mapping expeditions from 1819 to 1822, and then 1825 to 1827. So he had already mapped quite a bit of the continental coastline of Canada. And then you can see his from 1845 to 1847, where he had gone first winter. He ends up at Cornwallis Island, which is the second blue dot. And then the third blue dot down is where Erebus and Terror in 1846 are pushed out of the water and are beset in ice. And then the fourth blue dot, if you go a bit to the right of that, that's actually where Terror was found in 2016. And then the bottom blue dot, again, if you go a bit to the right of that, is where Erebus was found in 2014. Now, so he almost did, had he put in about another 150, 180 nautical miles, he would have actually have been the first person to have made it through the Northwest Passage. And his wife, Lady Franklin, actually wanted to have it recognized that he was the first person to go through. But now, since we found Erebus and Terror, we know that he almost did, but not quite. That plaque on the left-hand side is actually from Penetanguishene, so 160 kilometers north of here on Georgian Bay. That's where the second expedition was launched from. And it also happens to be located right across the road from where my wife grew up as a little girl in Penetanguishene. So I thought I had to add that one. But yeah, so his second expedition actually starts in Penetanguishene. Now, there are two forensic projects that were conducted during the 1980s on the remains of Franklin's crew members. So the first is on King William Island, and on King William Island, there are a couple of campsites that were found with skeletal remains. Now, the lead forensic anthropologist is Owen Beatty to the left, and then John Geiger, who was with Beatty and who co-authored the book Frozen in Time. John is now currently Chief Executive Officer of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. So they conducted surveys on King William Island, and they found between 7 to 15 skeletal remains, European skeletal remains, which were traced back to Franklin's expedition. The bones discovered showed scurvy had set in. There was a lot of pitting and scaling in the bones, and there was evidence of hemorrhaging and bone remodeling. All symptoms of scurvy and advanced scurvy. So clearly by this point in time, post 1846, between 1846 and 1850, the crew had already started suffering from scurvy. And also on King William Island, you'll notice sort of circles. Well, those circles are the outlines of tents. So that's where the tents would have been. And around the tents is actually, the indication is where all the bone fragments were. So basically what was happening was they were eating their deceased comrades inside the tents, but throwing out the human remains outside along the tents. And that's where these bone fragments are found, like this bone fragment up on the screen. You can see two cut marks where clearly the bone had been butchered, and this was found throughout. They basically found that they were eating the arms, the legs, and the skulls, and not the torso. And they think it was because the torsos were just too heavy to carry. And so it was the skulls, arms, and legs that were being eaten. Lead, there was a lot of lead found in the bones, and the lead levels were higher in the European bones found on King William Island than on Inuit bones found on King William Island. Lead occurs naturally in the environment. We all have lead in our bodies, but the Inuit who lived in that area, King William Island, Nunavut, had much lower lead levels than the English British sailors did. Now, initially, we thought it was the lead that was the main reason for the crew dying off, lead poisoning, but as I go through this, we'll see from later studies that there were other sources. So while lead was still important in the demise of Franklin's crews, based on 1980s technology that had back then to do the analyses, by 2013, 2016, you'll see that there were other reasons for the demise of the crew members. So then on Beechey Island, so the next series of photographs I'm going to show will show human remains. So if anyone's squeamish about it, I'm just letting you know. Since most of us have military backgrounds, it's probably not an issue. But anyhow, so that Devon Island, and down the bottom you can see Beechey Island. Beechey Island, it actually becomes an island at high tide. At low tide, you can walk over to Devon Island. Here are the grave sites on Beechey Island. So this is the archaeological team from the 1980s. This is John Torrington, who was petty officer on HMS Terror. All three bodies were buried below the permafrost, so they were just completely intact. And to get down to the bodies, you had to dig slowly, pick down, and then put boiling water over top to melt down a bit through the permafrost, dig a bit more boiling water. And so we progressively got down to the remains of these one Marine and two sailors. There's Torrington again, you can see perfectly preserved. So samples were taken for scientific study on the crew members. You can see too that in Torrington's grave they took a great deal of care in burying him. The ship's carpenters shaved off wood to create a little pillow for him inside the casket. A great deal of care was taken in burying these men. And so that shows you that initially a great deal of care is taken to take care of the crew members, and then a couple of years later they're so desperate for food they're eating their fellow crew members who've died. They're not being buried properly. This is John Hartnell, who was able seaman on HMS Erebus. And this is William Bain, who is a Royal Marine. The red is a red piece of cloth, and the dye had started leaching out of it. Now, conclusions, 1980s conclusions, are that Torrington, Hartnell, and Bain Brain had all suffered from tuberculosis and died of pneumonia. We still believe that. We question right now how much lead actually was the main culprit, and that's what later scientific studies now question. But anyhow, so lead does lead to aping, becomes an aping disease, and it simulates dozens of other conditions. And it leads to discoloration of the gums, abdominal colic, shooting pains of the limbs, all suggest scurvy, and then pulling the heavily laden sledges. If you have scurvy, doing a lot of physical work actually makes your physical condition worse. And so in 2013, now a few decades later, a couple of decades later, with new scientific equipment, scientists were able to determine that there's actually no real difference between the lead levels of the sailors from when they left Europe to when they died, because initially the cans of food that they were eating from had pieces of solder in the cans. The cans are very poorly soldered, so the lead would have leached out into the meat. But that doesn't really seem to have been the main factor of the crew members' demise. From the breakdown of the bones from later studies, it basically showed that there wasn't much difference in the lead levels from the time when they left Europe to the time they died in the Northwest Passage. The 2016 study indicated that, again, based on the three men found on Beechey Island, because there was more tissue sample to actually do studies on, that it was low levels of zinc. The zinc, the 2016 study found levels of zinc were far lower than normal due to the lack of meat in the expedition's diet, and indicated that John Hartnell would have been suffering from chronic zinc deficiency sufficient to severely suppress his immune system and left him vulnerable to worsening tuberculosis as he was already infected. So deficiency in zinc does aggravate tuberculosis, and even the 1980 study showed that all three men had tuberculosis. And in the last few weeks of Hartnell's life, his illness would have caused his body to start breaking down bone, fat, and muscle tissue, releasing lead previously stored into his bloodstream and giving the release high levels of lead, which was picked up in the 1980s. So as the way his body broke down led to higher levels, lead levels being picked up in the 1980s. With more primitive equipment, with more advanced scientific equipment, we can now determine that it was just in the last few weeks of his life where his lead levels spiked. But again, these were lead levels that he would have acquired back in Europe. So this is the 2014 Victoria Strait expedition. That's myself and John Geiger. We're on floating sea ice. This is the point of abandonment where the ships were forced up onto sea ice in 1846. So we were able to get off the ship. As you can see, we were running into ice conditions. We had to stop the expedition at that point to find clearer patches of water to navigate through. So John and I, along with one other person, we grabbed a Zodiac and we made it out to some sea ice and had our pictures taken with the Royal Canadian Geographical Society flag. You know, you have to get the T-shirt, been there, done that, and so, you know. So you can see, where that photograph was taken, where John and I are on the sea ice, is at the very bottom of that red line, marked 1846. And there were two search zones. We were supposed to be in the northern search zone. That's where we thought Erebus and Terror would be. And then there was a south search zone, which had been examined 6 times previously and nothing had been found. Northern search zone had been examined on 2 previous expeditions, and again nothing was found. So we thought that we would go to the north search zone in 2014. Trouble was the ice was so bad that the expedition was forced down to the south search zone. And you can actually see the ice. So under north search zone, that darker white are actual ice conditions from satellite photography. And you can see that it was virtually impossible to operate in that area. So this shows the ice melting a little later on in the season, and you can see that stream of ice going south. That's what we think carried Erebus to its location, is when it was abandoned on the ice melted and dragged it down, or it floated down to where it is eventually found in the south search zone. So you can see 1848, that's where Erebus was, where we found her in 2014. So she would have floated down on top of sea ice that was melting in the spring and summer. And when I say summer, summer up there is August and the first 2 weeks of September. So you've got 6 weeks, that's summer. And this is location of Erebus in 2014. This is what Erebus looked like in the first side scan sonar. That's where Terror was found in 2016, ironically in Terror Bay. The officer the day of the Royal Naval vessel that was surveying King William Island. The crew, the surveyors came aboard ship one day and asked the officer of the watch, what should we call this bay? And he said, Terror Bay. And ironically, that's where Terror sank. They actually had no idea that it had sunk there. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner the side scan of Terror, and she's perfectly intact. Again, these are just ice conditions going through Victoria Strait. So you can see how Erebus and Terror were caught in the ice. The ice just doesn't move there, and they were pushed up onto the ice, and the ships were on the ice for at least 2 years. There were 7 vessels involved in the 2014 expedition. These are 3 of the 7. We were the largest expedition since 1850 to go out and look for Erebus and Terror. Altogether, there were 209 members of the expedition on a total of 4 large vessels and 3 smaller vessels. This is what most of the 3 weeks looked like. We were told that there wouldn't be much ice up there. And by the Canadian Ice Service, they said, yeah, spring was bad for ice, but by the time you're up there in August, it'll be good. Well, that's what 3 weeks up on Victoria Strait looked like. And it really did drive home what it must have been like for the men of Erebus and Terror. Again, these are our ice charts. The red is 90% ice coverage, and that's primarily in the North Search Zone, so we couldn't continue searching where we had planned, so we had to move south. Here we're transferring ships, like we're transferring vessels from the Investigator from, I was on a Russian ship, the academic Sergei Vavilov, and we were carrying the Investigator, and we transferred her over to the Sir Wilfrid Laurier from the Canadian Coast Guard. This piece of kit was developed by NATO. It cost $10 million. It was the most advanced piece of kit at the time. It could go underwater, and you could get at what we call cutting the lawn. You could set it in pre-position transits, and it had an antenna, so it could come up, receive instructions, and go back down, and it would constantly chart, because there were other scientific reasons for the expedition, and part of it was we wanted to survey 1,400 square kilometers of seabed, because 90% of the Northwest Passage is not, hasn't been surveyed. Because the ice was so bad, we were only able to survey 41 square kilometers, but we were able to prove that this ROV, the AUV, could actually operate in cold waters. Now, what happened was the archaeologists on the Wilfrid Laurier wanted to examine an Inuit site that they had spotted a few years before, and you can see that circle. So that circle would have been rocks to hold down the skin of an Inuit tent, and so this would have been a hunting cabin, hunting tent. And so anyhow, the archaeologist asked the helicopter pilot from the Wilfrid Laurier, the icebreaker, to fly them out, and they wanted to do some archaeological research. So Andrew Sterling, the pilot, who was also an amateur archaeologist, agreed to take out Doug Stanton and his team. And while they're on this island, on Wilmont Island, the helicopter pilot spots this piece of metal. And on it, they find 2 broad arrows. Well, anyone who knows anything about British military history, the British military identified their equipment with broad arrow marks on them. So this indicated that Erebus and Terror had to be nearby, because no other British warships had ever sunk in this region. And then shortly thereafter, Andrew Sterling, the pilot, found this wooden hawser plug. So hawser plugs are on the decks of the ship where the cables go in, and they put the plug on top, so in rough seas you don't get water washing over the decks and into the hold where the cables are stored. So that brought the Parks Canada team to come closer to shore. They'd always stayed further away from shore from Wilmot Island because of all the rock reefs, and they were worried about their ROV equipment being snagged on rocks, torn off, and that would have been the end of your expedition for that year, and plus you would have lost $70,000 worth of kit. So because they found the hawser plug, the piece of metal, the davit from a ship's davit, they came closer to shore. And here, this is the very first scan of HMS Erebus. You can see there's damage to the stern section, and you can also see some planking missing from the deck. But otherwise, she's in good shape. She sank in 36 feet of water. And so anyhow, on September 9th, it's announced that we'd found Erebus, and the prime thing found almost immediately was the ship's bell. And Jonathan Moore, one of the Parks Canada underwater archaeologists, he discovered the Erebus's bell. And that September, there was only 3 days worth of diving. 15 dives were conducted because the weather had gotten so bad that the icebreaker supporting Wilfrid Laurier had to leave the area to break commercial shipping out of the ice in the Northwest Passage. So it limited the dive season to 3 days. In 2015, Parks Canada brings in Royal Canadian clearance divers from Halifax and Esquimalt. There's a photograph of the Canadian Navy divers. And so they dive with the underwater archaeologists. They're given a crash course in underwater archaeology so that they can double the number of teams underwater at any one time. And so the first year they thoroughly examined the hull of Erebus. And they also do biological research because now marine biologists are fascinated by this because they know the ship went down roughly 1848, 1850, and they can look at all the growth on the ship and determine the rate of growth of biological materials in that area. So it also served biological purposes. Then when the survey was done, they cleared off the deck and hull to conduct further underwater archaeology. 39 artifacts were recovered from Erebus that year, and the water initially was very clear, then it deteriorated, and that's what they find in that region is 1 year you've got great diving, and the next year the water conditions are really bad that you can't see a meter out in front of you. In 2016, by accident, and actually found by a Canadian ranger, an Inuit Canadian ranger out of Joe Haven. He leads the Arctic Research Foundation's ship out to the Terror site. He and his uncle a few years before had seen masts sticking up through the ice, but they didn't report it to anyone because they didn't think anyone would believe them. Anyhow, so he led them to Terror's site. Terror's down 70 feet, and she's in perfect shape because she doesn't receive any ice damage or current damage. And in 2016, the water quality around Erebus was extremely poor. 2017, they start, and this shows you the complexity of trying to do underwater archaeology up in the Northwest Passage, is that they initially go through the ice in the spring and conduct ROV surveys of Terror, and later on the summer they try and do some diving on Erebus, but they were only able to get one dive in on Erebus due to poor water conditions. 2018, that was a really bad year for ice, and it took almost the entire season for Parks Canada to get their research vessel from Vancouver up to the Erebus and Terror site. The ice was so bad, and so very little diving was done. What they did manage to do is build the support station above the Erebus site. So that's the platform for all dive support to HMS Erebus. And this, the platform is kept in Joe Haven during the winter months and towed out to the Erebus site during the summer months. So this is what they've been able to achieve by 2018. Again, myself as a scuba diver, you know, these are incredibly difficult waters to dive in, to do all the logistical support in. 2019, they send down ROVs into Terror, and they find she's in pristine condition. You can see plates on the racks. You can see wine bottles. It's an amazing wreck. She sank going straight down, and so her contents are just in perfect shape. In 2019, they pulled up 350 artifacts from the ship, from Terror. And then COVID hits, nothing happens for a few years. And then in 2020, Parks Canada underwater archaeologists again set up an ice camp over Erebus, and they check on the physical condition of Erebus, and they have found that between 2014, when she was discovered, to 2022, that Erebus has really deteriorated because of the wave action, and because she's only in 36 feet of water. She's pancaked by sea ice as the tides go in and out, so she's being crushed. So in 2022, the entire effort is on Erebus. They don't do anything on Terror. And I think, so there were 56 dives over 11 days on Erebus. Again, she's a very dangerous wreck to dive on because the beams, the planking do move, and so the divers have to be aware of, you know, not being crushed. But I think the most interesting piece is near the end, they found a leather binder with paper inside it. Now, paper in the 1800s had very high cloth content in it. It's not like paper today. So they feel that, well, not they feel, they know that they can actually put it through chemical baths and through a series of different types of baths and restoration processes, they'll actually be able to read what's on each page. So hopefully this folder provides far more insight as to what happened to Franklin's expedition. And so right now, everything's in Ottawa at the restoration labs for Parks Canada. Anyhow, that concludes my presentation, which sadly has gone over time, but
it was riveting. Thank you very much, Joseph, for a riveting presentation. It's now time for questions, and as is my custom, because Joseph's eyes are much better than mine, I'm going to let him pick the questioners.
Gentleman in the back.
Yeah, I'm curious, you indicated the location where the two ships went up, were pushed up on the ice. What's the basis for the certainty regarding that position?
Again, in the Victoria Point notes, that's what were written on the notes, so the latitude, longitude.
Oh, so in the cairn.
Yeah, in the cairn, on the Victory Point cairn, yeah.
So they took a fix, a sextant fix.
Exactly.
All right.
Yeah. Gentlemen.
Hindsight being 2020, of course, if they had stayed with their ships, would they have had enough food driven found by the Ross expedition in the area that they abandon the ships? Would they may have been?
They would have actually been better off heading north, because in a couple hundred miles to the north, there's an area where three straits meet, and the water, even in January, February, is constantly churning, never freezes. So you have seals, polar bears, birds. There would have been a lot to hunt and eat. The trouble with the canned meat they had, even though they had 3 years of supply, the meat was boiled to such a degree that the nutrient value had been destroyed. So even though they were eating meat, it wasn't enough to sustain them. And then on top of that, military contracts being what they are, it went to the lime juice on board Erebus and Terror, which we know the vitamin C helps prevent scurvy. Well, the limes came from the British West Indies. The trouble is the British West Indies limes aren't as good as Mediterranean limes, which have higher vitamin C content, but the British didn't have a bunch of colonies in the Mediterranean, so they ended up with British West Indian limes. Then on top of that, to save space on the ship, they rendered down the lime juice, right? So now you've got rendered down lime juice, which means you boiled it and you destroyed the vitamin C content. So, so they would have starved, even though they had the 3 years worth of food. But had they gone a few hundred miles north, which again is counterintuitive because you don't want to head north, they starved because there wasn't fresh food. They then decided they were going to go south to a known Hudson's Bay post, which is on Back Falls River, which was, I think, 1,200 kilometers to the south, and that's what they started walking towards. The trouble is that part of the Arctic, the Northwest Passage in that part of the Arctic, it freezes over solid. It's known as a Arctic desert, so there aren't any openings in the ice. So you don't have seal, you don't have the birds to eat. So by staying in the area as long as they did, they were starving themselves. And by heading further south, again, they were going into an area where everything froze over and there wasn't any fresh meat. I mean, if you can eat, you can live off seal. I mean, the Inuit have for millennia, because seal provides all the minerals and vitamins and everything you need. But that area didn't have seal in it because there are no air holes for the seals to come up.
Two questions. One is that the torsos were left behind and the skulls were taken. Heads are very heavy. And so it's a considerable amount of weight to take a skull. I agree that the torso is heavier, but surely it's easier to butcher.
I'm just going on the archaeological evidence. The archaeological evidence shows that in the encampment sites, skulls were found. So the skulls were broken open, the brains were extracted, and they were eating the brains. And arms and legs. The torsos weren't found around the encampments.
And the other question is, one of the ships was found because the mast was sticking underwater.
Terror, yeah.
How long had that mast been sticking out of the water?
Well, she would have sank, we assume, she could have sank anywhere 1848 to 1850.
So well over 100 years.
Oh, yes, yeah. And the masts are no longer above water, they've been sheared off since. Well, again, this is a very remote part of Canada, and so it happened to be, and unfortunately I don't remember the ranger's name, but he and his uncle were hunting in that area. During the winter, it was frozen, they saw the mast. He actually had a camera with him, he took photographs, and then he dropped the camera into a hole in the water and lost the camera. And they get back to Joe Haven, and he thought, well, no one's going to believe this story, so he didn't tell anyone. Yeah, and then it's only been the last few years, well, certainly just prior to 2016, that the masts were severed. the upper portion of the mast. The lower portion of the mast are still intact.
You commented that the wreck of the Erebus has deteriorated so much in the last few years, and actually in connection with the mast as well. I'm amazed that they survived for 150 years, and then in a few years so much damage has been done. Is there any explanation?
Well, I mean, it's just getting to the point where the ship's getting weaker and weaker and weaker with, each year you've got the ice crushing down on it. You have the tides changing, every basically 5.5 hours, and storms blow up quickly, and they're fierce in that area, and so a lot of the storm surge damages the ship. So Terror, which is down 70 feet, doesn't receive any of that, so she's in pristine shape. Erebus also sank straight down, which they call sitting proud, but because she's only in 36 feet of water and so close to shore, the storm surge, the tides, the ice pancaking down on her, it's just weakening the structure progressively. I mean, the fact that she's even lasted this long is amazing.
How many, between when the relief expedition was, which was like 1849?
The first one, yeah.
Yeah, how many were between that and 2014?
Depending on what you read, in 2014, we were apparently the 42nd expedition to go look for her in 168 years. And we were the largest expedition since 1850. But I've seen different numbers. I've seen 46 expeditions. But anyhow, I'm sticking with 42.
Has there been any effort to raise the ship's bells?
Yeah, Erebus's bell has been raised. It's been in chemical baths to extract the salt and stabilize it. And I don't know if it's still in Canada or if it's been given to Britain, because the first 65 artifacts found, because these were British warships up until the time we found them, so the Royal Navy signed them over to Canada in 2018. So the agreement was the first 65 items found would go to Britain, and then from 66 on would stay in Canada, and then be divided between Canada and Nunavut.
We make sure the bells are 68, 69?
Well, Erebus's bell is in England, or will be going to England. Terror's bell hasn't been found yet, so Terror's bell will stay in Canada. And one of the interesting things with Terror was, like, both ships had propellers, and both ships had actually the two first steam locomotives used in the London Underground system, the London subway system. And I think they could generate about 20 horsepower. But back in 1845, these were the two most advanced ships in the entire world, and they had the most high technology known at the time in the world. They had desalinization, they had steam heating for the crew members, they had these locomotives to help navigate through the ice, so they weren't solely dependent on sail, because to tack through the ice, virtually impossible. So these were like, the top of the line ships, and so a lot of the technology being found on these two ships, or that will be recovered, are only found in these two vessels. There might be drawings of them in London, in British patent offices, but no actual physical examples left. So these are real treasure troves in regards to mid-Victorian, early Victorian technology. Very good.
These protected dive sites, or can anyone dive?
No, these are protected dive sites, so you cannot dive. Only Parks Canada underwater archaeologists can dive, and whoever else they have it with them, so potentially again, Royal Canadian Navy clearance divers, and they're training a couple of local members of the Inuit community out of Joe Haven to go down and act as assistants to the Parks Canada underwater archaeologists.
I think we have time, sorry. I think we have time for 2 more questions, plus your follow-on, sir.
You mentioned there was a Russian component.
Yeah.
What was the mix? I mean, it was basically a British-Canadian.
Well, Canada was a British colony at the time. So,
But on the actual expedition.
oh, sorry, on this, or on 2014?
Yes.
Yeah, so we were on a Russian ship, okay, so anyhow, the government of the day didn't want it to be called by its real name, the academic Sergei Vavilov, so it was renamed the Ocean Endeavour. And then the Canadian Navy did not want the AUV on that ship because this is $10 million of NATO technology on a Russian ship. So at the time, I was still in the Navy. It was a few months before I retired. So although I wasn't on the expedition, I was with the RCN, I was with the RCGS. But there was always someone sleeping in that box with the AUV. There was always 24/7 because we just didn't trust the Russians on it. Because the Russians, the academic Sergei Vavilov was ice hardened, could navigate through that region, and it also had cranes that could move equipment from one ship to another ship, which we couldn't find a Canadian ship that had that ability, that was ice hardened, plus had the crane lifting ability. But the Minister of the Environment at the time, she didn't want to sign off on the expedition because of the Russian ship, but the Prime Minister's office was dead set on going ahead with the 24th.
Him on that expedition. I mean, it was in their best interest.
Well, the Russians were renting out the ships anyhow because it was, my own personal view is the Russians rented out the ships because it was a moneymaker for them and they didn't have anything else to do with them. These 2 ships, like the academic Vavilov and its sister ship, whose name I don't recall, IOF, are not allowed in any American port because they carry so much in the way of electronic intelligence gathering. And for years they've been renting them to Canadian companies to do Arctic, Northwest Passage cruises. And they were just mapping Canadian waters, getting maps that even Canada doesn't have. But anyway, that's my personal point of view. I could be totally wrong. But.
Last question?
A bit of a sidebar to the Franklin thing, but I think a direct point of interest that touches on our sovereignty. A couple of us were up on Beachy Island this summer.
Okay.
There's now 5 graves there.
Yeah.
The 5th one is a rich American who, when he died, had people fly him up there and bury him. I assume you deal with Parks Canada at a higher level than we do. Like, is there any thoughts on what they're going to do with that?
Well, there are 5 graves up there, but one is French.
Well, when we were standing there, and you can see the 5th grave, and it's not marked. So there's the 3 Franklins,
Yeah.
the 1 Sealer, and then this other one. And we were told that it's some rich American who died, and his family flew him up there, buried him, and flew away.
No, those graves all go back to the 1800s.
The 5th one too?
The 5th one too, yeah. They all go back to the 1800s, yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Joseph. It has been a wonderful evening. As my last official act as Chair Pro Tem of this series, I would like to invite my successor, James Ellis, to come up and present Joseph with a token of our appreciation.
There you go, Joseph. Okay. Great. Thank you very much.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.